I'm Ramu Damodaran, Chief of the United Nations Academic Impact. We at the Academic Impact, and indeed the United Nations itself, owe a great debt of gratitude to J. Michael Adams, who served as president of Fairleigh Dickinson University, where he pioneered a number of programs, including Pathways to Peace, bringing UN diplomats to the campus of FDU in New Jersey, the campus radio stations network, where he got radio stations in universities across the United States to broadcast United Nations program, and then finally his work with the International Association of University Presidents, enabling the United Nations to come up with, devise, and execute what we now know as the academic impact. In fact, our former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon once said, UNAI should be called the United Nations Adams Impact because we owe it to him. This annual lecture and conversation really represents two things which were essential to Michael. Lecturing, because he was a professor and professors need to lecture and communicate, but more important, conversation, because academics need to engage their audiences and audiences have to be invigorated by the subjects that they consider. This lecture today has been specifically important because it brings to focus an issue which is really high on not only the United Nations agenda, but the agenda of any thinking citizen in our world. The role of women in our world and the dangers of sexual violence in the many forms in which it occurs. We're grateful to all of those who've come to attend this and the many more who've watched on the webcast and can continue to do so in its archived version.
Good afternoon. My name is Susan Adams. I am the wife of J. Michael Adams, for whom this conversation and lecture series is named for. And it's such an honor to have Michael be recognized and acknowledged at the United Nations. One of the things that Michael believed in most was that education was a bridge to peace and that the UN was another part of that. And that there's a coincidence, a collateral energy to have the education system and the United Nations share with academic impact and efforts toward world peace.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone here today and those watching via webcast to the 4th annual J. Michael Adams Lecture and Conversation Series, which is organized by the United Nations Academic Impact, known as UNAI and one of the many acronyms in this building, which is housed in the UN Department of Public Information. UNAI aligns institutions of higher education with the aims of the UN, such as promoting and protecting human rights, gaining access to education, achieving the SDGs, and resolving conflicts. Through their activities and research, institutes of higher education are encouraged to help advance the UN agenda. This is very valuable work. Today, we are honored to have with us our distinguished keynote speaker, Ruchira Gupta, Adjunct Associate Professor at the Center for Global Affairs at New York University, which is a UNAI member institution. We also welcome our principal discussant, His Excellency Hajime Kishimori, Counselor of the Permanent Mission of Japan to the UN, and Rapporteur of the General Assembly Committee on Information. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Susan Adams here with me, and the other members of the family of J. Michael Adams. J. Michael Adams, in whose name we are gathered here today, was an educator, author, and advocate of global citizenship, who led Fairleigh Dickinson University. Under his leadership, his university was the first to earn special consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council, in whose chamber we now sit. Every year we honor his memory by holding a UNAI lecture and conversation series on a topic of global significance. Past issues have addressed the issues of women and science, the United Nations past and future, and globalization, just to name a few huge topics. This year, our topic is the grave matter of sexual violence. This is an issue sadly familiar to the UN and one that this organization has long sought to address, whether by ensuring that the landmark Beijing Declaration of 1995, adopted at the Fourth World Conference on Women, prioritized an end to any gender-based violence against women, or through a landmark resolution adopted in the Security Council. Resolution 1325 called for the increased participation of women and the incorporation of gender perspectives in all UN peace and security efforts, and for the protection of women and girls from gender-based violence in situations of armed conflict. Most recently, at the start of this year, Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a report calling for a new approach to ensure protection for victims of sexual exploitation and abuse by UN personnel. The approach calls for putting victims first, ending impunity, engaging civil society and external partners, and improving strategic communications for education and transparency. The Secretary General again took up these themes at the recent General Assembly and has been very clear on this topic. There will be a zero-tolerance policy of the UN. He has been equally blunt on the topic of sexual violence, calling it, quote, a threat to every individual's right to a life of dignity and to humanity's collective peace and security, end quote. In this same vein, the United Nations has also underscored that men and boys may also become victims of sexual violence in situations of trafficking as well as conflict. Ending sexual violence and women's rights go hand in hand. Women's rights are central to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Goal 5 under that agenda in particular calls for gender equality and the empowering of all women and girls, including the elimination of all forms of violence against all women and girls. It is in support of these aims that the European Union recently pledged a very generous 500 million euros and to partner with the UN to end violence against women and girls. There is momentum on our side and political will. I think there is room for optimism that we will see within our generation a stop to all, or perhaps probably most, forms of violence against women and girls. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ruchira Gupta, an Adjunct Associate Professor at New York University, as I said, where she teaches courses on the scourge of human trafficking. Professor Gupta is also the founder and president of Apne Aap Women Worldwide, a grassroots movement to end sex trafficking and increase choices for at-risk girls and women. She received an Emmy Award in 1996 for her work Selling of Innocence, a documentary shedding light on modern-day sex slavery. Her remarks today are titled Women Uniting Nations, a conversation on struggles against sexual violence around the world. Professor Gupta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Namaste. I'd like to start by thanking the United Nations Academic Impact for hosting this opportunity for me to be able to give a talk about something I care about deeply, the sexual violence or the epidemic of sexual violence that we face in the world today. So thank you, Ramu Damodaran, for taking the initiative to invite me to speak, and thank you to everyone present today who have come from different schools, colleges, to be able to participate in this important conversation. I'm pleased to be able to give the 4th annual Michael Adams Lecture, and I thank his family members who are present today for organizing this lecture and creating again an opportunity to create conversations every year around important topics. This topic is particularly relevant and important because sexual violence has become a global epidemic. It's not about the Congo. We often hear that women in Congo are being raped, but it's right here. There are 70 million women in the world right now who are victims of sexual assault in some form or the other. 1 in 3 women in her lifetime is likely to have been assaulted or face some kind of sexual abuse. Women are in danger from the time they are born till the time they die. In my own country, India, women could be victims of feticide. Should they be born, they could be victims of infanticide due to something called son preference, which exists both in India, China, and many parts of South and Southeast Asia. Should they survive this feticide and infanticide, they could very likely be victims of child marriage. And child marriage, as many of you know who are working on issues related to women and girls, is also a form of sexual assault, because these girls, their bodies are not fully formed and they are subjected to sex, and that is like rape for many of them. They become pregnant before their bodies are fully formed and then are victims of maternal mortality. As we know, maternal mortality is one of the highest killers of women anywhere in the world today. And even in the United States, laws are being passed in state after state to stop child marriage. Should they survive child marriage and maternal mortality in many parts of the world, they could be victims of dowry. And dowry is a form of extracting money by a family that a girl is married into in patrilocal cultures, where the girl's family is supposed to provide for the housing and for the looking after of the girl when she gets married into her husband's family. And again, in parts of South Asia, very often women are burned, women are killed, women are coerced to bring in more and more money from their parents' family. Should they survive this? We have all heard of domestic violence in the United States and many parts of Latin America, Africa, Europe, across the world, I would say. Domestic violence is so prevalent that now we say that 1 in 3 women are subject to domestic violence in their lifetimes. Beyond domestic violence and the killing from that and the murders from that is a possibility that in many places women who are married very often early to older men might become widows, and because the families do not want them to inherit property, they could be discarded and die in small temple towns and other places just as beggars or as prostituted women. That is a subject that I also want to come to, is the fact that the sex trafficking of women has become one of the biggest issues in our world today. It's often defined as modern-day slavery, but I would like to talk about it as sexual violence and beyond modern-day slavery. It has dimensions of slavery, but it is not just slavery, it is a kind of misogyny. Women are bought and sold because they are female, because they are made to be humiliated for their sex and sexuality. People want to control their sex and sexuality. The numbers of women and girls who are trafficked for prostitution, for child marriage, for domestic servitude is going up every day. And the numbers vary from 41 million women to 21 million. And the numbers vary according to the person collecting the data and how they define this kind of sexual slavery. The tragedy, though, is that it is the third largest criminal enterprise in the world. The United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime says that it follows closely on the heels of arms trafficking and drug trafficking, and sometimes, very recently, the UNODC also says that the trend shows that it's probably crossing drug trafficking because women and girls can be bought and sold again and again. The biggest tragedy here is that the numbers of those trafficked for sex is going up and the age is coming down. In India, the youngest person I have met is a 7-year-old. She was trafficked and prostituted even before she had begun menstruating, and ice was used to break her. Very recently, just last week, you may have read about an FBI operation in which 61 victims of human trafficking were rescued right in our city, New York. Of this, there were some who were babies, 5-month, 6-month-old babies. So you can think about the trends and where it is going in terms of the sexual violence done to women and girls simply because they are female. This trend is being described by many scholars and professors as femicide. and this is a new term which is coined and taken off from the word genocide. Femicide stands for the killing of women because they are female. Now this is rooted in three kinds of things. One, of course, it is rooted in misogyny, the killing of female because they are female. The second is it is rooted in militarism, which is where a kind of masculinity which is promoted, connected to violence with militarism, the conquering of countries, the conquering of bodies. Rape has now been defined as a weapon of war. So that is the second M that I would talk about. And the third is machoism, where men have to show their control by subjugating women's bodies. And all these become the root causes for the kind of sexual violence that women all over the world face. Sex trafficking being one of them, the prostituting of women and girls being one of them, the ages coming down, the demand for younger and younger girls, a manifestation of this. What's happening though is that while this misogyny is growing all over the world and the sexual violence growing in the world, at the same time there is a resistance to it. And that is what I want to talk about after painting this grim picture of the fact that the demographics has changed so much in the world because of this misogyny, because of the killing of women, because they are female, that today there are more men in the world than women. There is also a resistance to this kind of violence, and that resistance is cutting across borders, boundaries, countries. And that is why the topic that I have chosen to speak about today is called Women Uniting Nations. Because while men are principally the ones making war, fighting the wars, being sent out as breadwinners, maybe to defend their countries, because that is the stereotypical role placed on men. At the same time, what is happening is that women have a stake in the future which is different. They're giving birth to children, and they need to defend the future for the sake of the children. And they are the ones who are taking the leadership in making peace. Alison spoke about the Resolution 1325 of the United Nations, which talks about women, peace and security, in which there is a demand for women to be at the peace table. Now there are a couple of reasons why this is really critical that women be at the peace table, to not just talk about the resistance and the pervasive sexual violence they face, but also because they have the tools to be able to create the peace. And one of the biggest tools which helps women to be able to create the peace at peace tables and negotiate is that women don't have to prove their masculinity. The burden of masculinity on men has become so toxic and so difficult that they find themselves trapped in trying to prove who they are, how they should perform, what they should do. And today we are in a situation where toxic masculinity is holding sway and deciding on world cultures, as we know. So this happens inside the home, but what happens inside the home then slowly spreads out into foreign policy, into domestic culture, into international cultures. The resistance that women are taking on are so concrete. First, they're resisting inside the house. Till 20 years ago, many of you may remember that domestic violence was not considered a crime. It was considered life. People used to say, this is the way it is, it's a private matter, I'm not going to interfere. Today, domestic violence is considered a crime because women's movements have resisted. And again, Alison spoke about the fact that there was the Beijing Women's Conference which changed things for women. That was the first time when people spoke about women's rights are human rights. And from that day onwards, the debates around what women should do, how they could do it, what were the situations they faced, and domestic violence was one of them primarily, where women spoke about, there was a tribunal in Beijing, I attended that, in which there was woman after woman from different countries, from India, from Nepal, from Pakistan, from Thailand, from Philippines, from the United States, from Colombia, from Mexico, from UK, from South Africa, country after country, women were speaking up about the domestic violence they faced, including, I remember, a black woman from America who spoke about the fact that she was almost killed and murdered because she had tried to escape from her husband, who was beating her black and blue, and there were no restraining orders around him. Today that is not possible. Laws are there, and women are speaking up, and men are supporting them, and men have realized it's not okay, and they can be punished. So cultures are changing. The same thing has happened with women uniting around nations to create laws and denormalizing sexual violence. And the most current one being Ashley Judd, the actor, who has spoken up against the sexual violence that she faced in Hollywood. Now this is critically important because Hollywood does set world cultures, and for her to speak up against not just an eminent director, but someone who owns one of the most important production companies in Hollywood, first Miramax and then the Weinstein Group, for Ashley Judd to speak up about what happened to her has unleashed a storm. And now there is a Me Too campaign with the hashtag Me Too, which is moving again from country to country to country, where women are speaking about the sexual assault which has happened to them, from being asked to do blowjobs, from being asked to provide sexual favors to their bosses, the casting couch, and it has spread from Hollywood again to Bollywood in India, which I read closely about, and women are speaking up again. And what this has done is that there are now more than 5 million likes on hashtags around Me Too, where women are speaking up about the kind of sexual violence they have faced. The interesting thing is that now there are boys and men who are speaking up about the sexual violence they have faced, showing how pervasive this is. The perpetrators, though, have all been identified as men. Now, who are these men? Again, products of this toxic masculinity which has normalized the violence they must perpetuate. And Ashley Judd's own story and her courage, which is now contagious as we talk about it, begins 20 years ago, when she thought about speaking but did not have the courage to. For many years, she would visit with different organizations across the world, sit in circles of women who were sexually assaulted, who were in Africa and in India, talk to them, hear them break their silence, till the moment when she found the courage. And again, I have a personal story with Ashley Judd, where she actually came to Delhi and then to Calcutta, where she sat in a circle in the brothels of India with a group of women who had been trafficked when they were between the ages of 9 and 13, brutalized, raped repeatedly 8 or 10 times a night, and they were breaking their silence to speak up because they wanted a different future for their daughters. And Ashley spent time with them, hearing them, and the first time that she wrote about her own sexual assault was in a book that she went on to write called All That Is Bitter and Sweet, and eventually take on the very industry which gives her jobs and payments. So courage is contagious, and as Gloria Steinem says, that she often quotes a book by a professor in University of Texas called Sex and World Peace, where she says that if we normalize sexual violence in the house, we are likely to normalize sexual violence outside, and the sexual violence outside, and of course we will have a discussion on this, also affects world peace in every different way. There are certain issues which we can see manifest right now in terms of the effect of sexual violence in foreign policy across borders and boundaries, but besides the sex trafficking of women and girls and the domestic violence that women face, there is also this huge refugee crisis and violence in conflict areas. Women are often forced to give in to sugar daddies and be sexually available to the people who are in charge of distribution of food, in charge of distribution of even mobility, in charge of some kind of safety in conflict zones, and therefore they become the first victims of sexual violence in those areas in exchange for those who have the power to be able to distribute and give them access to their basic needs. Now, the Secretary General's zero tolerance policy of sexual violence, again, is a result of women who have spoken up. Many of us have heard of the Women and Black movement where women would stand in on different borders where the countries were at war, and the women would stand in black silently protesting the violence in war and demanding peace. Just 2 years ago, there was a group of women led by Gloria Steinem who actually crossed the border between the two Koreas demanding peace and not war. The new foreign minister of Korea, who is a woman, says that if one Korea is bombed, the other one is not going to survive too. So women understand it. And at the same time, when this Korean foreign minister was talking about it, she was being taught how to perpetuate a feminist foreign policy by the Swedish foreign minister, Margot Wallström, who has often been speaking at the UN on different occasions about what does a feminist foreign policy mean and why should a country have a feminist foreign policy. She speaks about that in the context of the sexual violence, but she also makes the connection between the sexual violence and world peace. She says that the violence which is first normalized at home and the acceptance of a patriarch as the head of the family often leads us to accept violence outside, because a child growing up at home very often sees that it's all right for one class of human beings to order, one class of human beings to obey. So gender digs a trench inside our brain into which all other inequalities fall, especially the understanding and acceptance of violence. The child also sees that the mother can be abused, seeks approval from the father, will not get paid for her work, while the father can be abusive, aggressive, has to be the breadwinner, has the prison of his own burdens. And so a role reversal of this can be promoted through both domestic and foreign policies, and Margot Wallström talks about this fact that the role reverse could be that more men could play the role of carers, of people who look after children, and more women could go outside and be breadwinners. Now this is a very revolutionary concept because for now, in the world that we see it, because of the normalization of this kind of division of roles between men and women, we see that women are forced to do certain things, deprived of wages and pay, and men are forced to do certain things also in prisons which they want to get out of the trap of. And we see this in terms of how many men go to war, have to fight wars, come back psychologically damaged, and are violent again inside home. So the cycle continues and the sexual violence doesn't stop. And then manifests in so many other things, as in wage gaps, in participation of women in political and economic situations, in the livelihoods that we earn, the malnutrition subjected on little girls as they're growing up, and how can this be reversed is what women are talking about when they are trying to unite nations. They are trying to talk about these issues by comparing data from one country to another country to another country. But at the same time, what they're also trying to do is hold conversations in meetings, just like the one which began with the Beijing Women's Conference, but continues in the UN every March during the Commission on Status of Women, and across the world as we speak about different issues. For example, I can speak again about the UN protocol to end trafficking of women and girls, especially women and children. This protocol was created by building friendships and alliances to challenge the very sex industry, which is so huge. And the first time that this was articulated was by groups of women in the Philippines and Thailand, who saw the huge amounts of violence subjected to farmers' daughters who were trafficked to Patpong in Bangkok and to Subic Bay, and girls who were made sexually available for repeated rapes for men after men. And once the women of Thailand and Philippines began to speak up about it, then the women in India said, oh, but this is going on in our country too, in Sonagachi and Kamtipura. These are also bases, red light areas which were set up for soldiers, but not for American soldiers. They were set up for British soldiers under colonialism to provide disease-free women to be available to those in the service of the British Empire. And this has led to the fact that the red light areas continue to this day. And then the women in America began to understand that there was a sex industry here, not in brothels, but women were being sold right on Broadway and in places in San Francisco and of course in Nevada and Las Vegas. And they began to talk together to see what is the best way out. The first country which came up with an idea to how to combat that was Sweden, which also bases its other laws on equality to create the security for women inside the home and outside when they go to work. And what Sweden did was create the first law in which they decriminalized women in prostitution and criminalized those who purchase sex, the buying of sex. So they shifted the blame from the victim to perpetrator, just as the United States had done with its domestic violence laws. They took it into the public realm. And this then led to a spate of countries doing the same. So Norway looked around when it had to create its laws to combat trafficking, and Norway did the same. Iceland did the same. Ireland did the same. France has done the same. So country after country, and women are working across these countries to be able to do that. And this challenge to the sex industry is having repercussions on other domains of sexual violence, which I try to touch upon, where we are redefining what sexual violence is itself, from sexual harassment in the workplace to marital rape, to rape as a weapon of war, to the conflict, to the sexual assault on women in conflict situations, to malnutrition, to deprivation and discrimination of certain kinds of livelihood, to participation in political and economic platforms in the same equitable and equal way. And of course, the final thing is the wage gap, which keeps women behind in locked-in situations. So, so my final analysis of the whole situation that women are facing is that today the United Nations is thinking about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, but the Sustainable Development Goals cannot be achieved, neither 16 nor 17, without SDG 5, because the sexual violence done to women and girls, just because they are female, the femicide that women and girls are subjected to, is going to hold all the other goals back. Women will not be able to participate in education, they will not be able to access healthcare, they will not be able to sit at the peace table, participate in political discussions, if they feel insecure both at home and abroad walking out. And therefore sexual violence and the curbing of sexual violence is connected to world peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gupta or Ruchira, if I may say so. That was an extremely comprehensive and well tied together look at how every solution for women is tied to every other solution for women, which is why it's so important that we speak on this theme. I now give the floor to Mr. Hajime Shimori, Counselor of the Permanent Mission of Japan to the United Nations and Rapporteur of the General Assembly Committee on Information. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Ruchira, for your comprehensive presentation. I learned a lot, very inspiring, knowledge-oriented. But sometimes I felt a bit uncomfortable because I'm the only man on the podium. So I felt like I am to blame on behalf of all men. So I try to be positive on my presentations. And I have to confess that I have a general tendency to speak long, unless my wife interrupts or cuts me. And today my wife is not with me, so I have already limited myself to talk about only two subjects. Both are related with art and culture. And also I try to speak from the viewpoint of human security, that is empowerment of women. First, based on my experience, I was UNHCR staff for 4 years. In that capacity, I visited many camps, refugee camps, and one of those was in Mesop in Thailand. Karens escaped from Myanmar at that time. And I brought a chef, Japanese chef, who is trying to give the recipe for some Japanese food to the refugee women. because we didn't want to bring luxurious, tasty Japanese food. One shot deal is maybe happy for the instantly, but as soon as we leave, the refugees may feel a bit isolated. That's why we decided to give a recipe. So without bringing anything from Japan, using only the things available in the local market. That way, he created two Japanese dish, and we had one together. The real happiness came a year after, when another mission went to the same camping method from Japan, and they found out that these two Japanese dishes were there, cooked by refugee mothers, saying that they learned this from some chef from Japan a year ago. Of course, they became a bit spicy and very different from Japanese standard a little bit. However, our recipe stayed there, and I hope it still remains there as a recipe inherited to the younger generation. What I'm saying is, maybe this cooking itself doesn't solve the refugee situation at all. I know that, they know that. However, being refugees in camps every day without any hope in the future, they need to be motivated. They need to be inspired to live day by day. And to that end, I think this art and culture helps. This time cooking, but I tried another art and culture, which is fashion as well. Uniqlo. I started with Uniqlo sort of clothing to the camps, like in Nepal or like in Ethiopia or in Tanzania. A lot, so that women especially can choose the colors they want from the clothes we brought with Uniqlo. I know I'm going into details and I have only 7 minutes, so I stop talking about individual cases. However, using this art and culture as a medium for the refugees, especially women, to be more proud of themselves, to take back their own sort of passion, food, sports, music, that kind of luxurious part of the life. And that leads me to talk about the second point, which is close to my current work in the United Nations. Japan is hosting World Assembly for Women next week in Tokyo. And from the United Nations, UN Women or Madam Patten of the Strategy on Sexual Exploitation and Conflict, they are going to attend. So upon their return to New York, Japan mission, together with partners, and especially with the DPI, we will host the 5th pieces event at the UN lobby, on the 13th of November, Monday, in 2 weeks' time at 2 o'clock. So this one, we have done 4 times so far, always together with the DPI. Starting from Martha Graham dance, some Japanese singers in Spanish for the songs composed by Argentina icon of folklore Panky, or calligraphy event for the Ocean Conference. So the last one was ASEAN 10 ambassadors and my ambassadors made one big floral arrangement together. That way, through art and culture, we'd like to provide an opportunity for us to think about what peace means to us in a bit different way. Different means there are so many conferences, seminars. I'm not complaining, I'm part of it, but still there may be some alternative way to achieve the same goal which is sustaining peace. The first priority of Mr. Guterres, my former boss as the UNHCR staff, for this particular year. So the 5th event is dedicated to women. How? I'm trying to invite Coke. Maybe you don't know Coke, but you may know Stomp, off-Broadway musical, something like that. And Yako Miyamoto is the only Japanese member of Stomp. And she will bring her own band COPE. 7 of them are all females. So they will perform. Not only that, we will invite the young women and the SRSG, lady ambassadors, and even I will come to join us as MC, possibly. I have to talk to her after this, but so that we can highlight on the positive aspects of females. No discrimination. Just we men support this event. COPE and female staff, female whoever from New York. So if you are interested in, you're most welcome. We'll send the invitation accordingly. Before closing, I just want to repeat that art and culture may not solve the problems, conflicts themselves, but it inspired us, at least motivated us towards that direction. And I believe in the power of art and culture to unite us. And that's not limited to women, but this time, talking about women, so I tend to dedicate this art and culture, its power to unite us to all women. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hishimori, for your thoughts. It's now time to open it up for questions. I ask only that you state your name and affiliation before your question. Who would like to be first? There's nobody. There. Yeah. Can you get to a microphone?
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for a very enlightening lecture. My question is addressed to Dr. Gupta. So I'm also from India, and my question is specifically about sexual violence against women in South Asia. And what I'm wondering about basically is that I remember when I was at university, I had to do a little project about sexual violence against women in the red light district in New Delhi. And when I approached the police, they said, oh, we cannot help you because as far as we're concerned, this area that you're talking about does not exist. But later on, when I approached the same officer, she said, well, officially I'm not supposed to talk about it. And unofficially, like without the knowledge of their higher-ups, the local policemen tend to help. But other than that, they tend to frighten, intimidate, even arrest these women who are essentially victims of the system. The justification they give is, why did they not come to us when they were trafficked? The truth of the matter is that many of these women live in shame after they've been trafficked and cannot go back. So when there are laws to protect women, but law enforcement refuses to take that into consideration because of maybe cultural norms or preconceived social ideas, how do you suppose we can work around this, even though women are campaigning at this point for stronger laws and for greater recognition of how serious this problem is? Thank you.
I have also questions that have come to us via the web, if I can ask you one which I think is related to that. Do you believe that the UN and your efforts can overcome cultural barriers to change ideology in countries in which sex trafficking is heavily practiced? And if so, how?
The scale of sex trafficking is huge, as I mentioned, and right now we don't even have the complete data because the industry is so underground, the women are so controlled and kept invisible by the traffickers that we don't even know how many. But there are two datas which are the most current. One is 41 million, of which 51% are women, and they were brought in as girls, and the other is 27 million. So you can imagine the number of women and girls who are trafficked in our world today. The other horrible data about India is that the Central Bureau of Investigation, and I'm quoting data which is 10 years old, says there are 3 million women and girls who are trapped in prostitution, of which 1.4 million are girls between the ages of 9 and 13, and the other 1.6 million were brought in as girls. So you can think about what is going on in India. Now, in terms of is there a response to combating sex trafficking in India or globally? Yes, there is. And the response has become more and more robust over the years, starting with, of course, the UN Protocol to End Trafficking in Persons, which was passed in 2000. And now we can see that there are countries changing the laws to meet the standards of the UN Protocol, including India. India came late to the table and changed its laws just in 2013 to define trafficking for the first time, and that law is known as Section 370 of the Indian Penal Code, which actually says recruitment, transfer, transport, harboring is a process of trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation by means of force or coercion. Also the abuse of vulnerability, which means that they recognize that women are unequal or more vulnerable groups are likely to be trafficked, which is also the core of the UN Protocol. Now, can cultures be changed to combat it? As you talked very correctly, that the police were either misogynistic, they were apathetic, they thought that some women are disposable women. I've heard in the course of my own work in 25 years now on this subject that men will be men, to excuse men who buy sex, or prostitution is as old as the hills. So my response to this is that, first of all, prostitution cannot be as old as the hills. It cannot be the oldest oppression. It cannot be the oldest profession. It can be the oldest oppression when men began to take control of women's bodies, and it cannot be an older occupation than farming or hunting because people had to eat first. So it's a flippant remark which is used by the sex industry to perpetuate prostitution. The other remark that men will be men, I think, is an insult to most men, because most men do not buy sex. A few do, and they are the repeat offenders, but most men do keep silent, and so therefore they are getting a bad name because of the few who are buying sex all the time. How can this culture be changed where we don't say men will be men or prostitution is the oldest occupation? One of them is the law, because laws do tend to have an impact on society, and we see this culture changing in Sweden, where they have created a law to decriminalize women and girls who are prostituted and criminalize pimps and johns. So what that has done is not only brought down prostitution, but it has brought down the demand for sex. And because of that, girls are not trafficked into the country in Sweden and Norway both. But also domestic violence has come down because suddenly people are talking about a culture in which it's not okay to commodify women. And so things are changing because of the law. And I think that is what we are seeing right now when I use the topic Women Uniting Nations, is that when different countries succeed and show that women in that country have actually changed the law which has benefited everyone, then another country says we want the same law, and this is what has happened with the trafficking law. Started with the UN Protocol, and it's happening. For example, the United States law, now victims of trafficking are not treated as illegal immigrants, but they're given a T visa to stay on in this country, get food, clothing, housing, and health support to start new lives and actually testify against the traffickers. So cultures can change, and I think the more we talk about it and break the silence, culture does change.
Mr. Kushimori, do you have anything to add?
Just briefly, I take up that part. Culture can change. Yes, I think so. In Japan, for instance, I admit that it has been a male chauvinistic tradition to be inherited. Like my father's generation, when married couple go out, the wives are supposed to walk 3 steps behind their husbands. For my generation, when I go out with my wife, we walk side by side. In younger generations, women take the lead and men follow. That's the situation generally in Japan. So we have been changing. Also, the law changes firmly and decisively as well. This is also a positive example, not sex trafficking, but it was only 30 years ago, 1986, when the Japanese Diet Congress made this legislation to treat men and women equally in terms of wages, the salary. But since then, like in my foreign ministry, more and more females entered as diplomats. So do the other private companies. So the culture itself is not enough to change the society. It should be firmly supported by law or some actions, legitimate actions. That way I hope these sex trafficking issues, which I'm not so expert of, should be hopefully changing as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have a question? There, and did I see another one? Okay, there are two. Ladies first. Please.
Yes, I'm Anne-Marie Carlson, Chair of the Committee on Teaching about the United Nations, CTAUN, C-T-A-U-N for short. I'm wondering, Dr. Gupta, what is the greatest challenge that you and others are facing? Is it getting more governments, local and national ones, to act? Not just to pass some more laws, or increasing greater awareness in the community, or maybe it's something else?
I would say both, because on one hand we struggle with getting better laws passed, which are more gender friendly, and it takes time first for the law to be implemented, then for those who have to implement the law to understand the law and actually implement it. But I think the biggest challenge is the culture of misogyny, in which sex trafficking and other forms of sexual violence are embedded. And to change that, so earlier, for example, we would hear men will be men or prostitution is the oldest occupation. I don't hear it anymore. People recognize that this is a problem and it's a crime, and there is a perpetrator. It's not a victimless crime. Demand drives sex industry. But also, what I find is that the new culture now is that everything is for sale. Market, the acceptance of the market as justifying everything. So women's bodies are for sale, and if somebody pays for it, then rape is all right. And that culture for me to challenge is harder because they say this is a choice, but what prostitution is really an absence of choice. To convey that and to take on this new culture, which is being promoted by the market, is harder these days.
A question from that?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My name is Hussein Maliki, a first counselor of the Human Initiative of the United Nations and ex-rapporteur of the Committee on Information before Hajime. And thank you very much, Madam Professor, for the very, very good pieces of information about the women's situation. Unfortunately, it's unfortunate that we are daily, hearing about this kind of activities, which is really, heinous act, you consider it. And thank you very much, Ramu, for arranging such a good meeting for us. My question from you, Professor Gupta, is that do you think that the current punishment, which is considered to a sex crime or the sex abuse, sex assault, is not sufficiently proportionate to the crime? For example, if a girl is assaulted, sexually by a boy, I don't know what kind of punishment he is facing in Western country. But in some cultures, if a girl is abused by a young man, as a man, and then the flower, this girl cannot marry. Unfortunately, nobody is willing to marry her. And it is the law calls that. That man who deflowered this girl should marry. And this is the punishment. Of course, maybe this is not a good solution anyhow. But do you think that if the punishment is harder than it right now, so can reduce the number of the sex assaults and abuses? Thank you.
Yes, it's always a deterrent when the perpetrators are punished rather than the victims. Customarily, because of the stigma attached to sexual crimes, women were being punished because they were stigmatized and they were forced to remain silent. And now, as laws are changing, the perpetrators are named and they are shamed. And laws are punishing them. So, for example, in domestic violence cases, the husbands are punished. In cases of sex trafficking, we are trying to get country after country to change laws in which those who buy sex are punished, not the women and girls. So once we have laws which punish the perpetrators, I think there will be a big change in the culture of the country also. The other problem is that marriage as the only solution for security for women is also, it narrows down choices for women. And what we need to do is create more participation in public spaces for women, so that they have other choices besides marriage. So they can choose to be married, but they can choose to be doctors, teachers, lawyers, political leaders outside of marriage as well, and in marriage as well. So they should have options, and if they have options, then a perpetrator cannot abuse them as easily. And the idea of someone who has raped a woman being told to marry her would not even come up as a solution, because for her that is like being married to a torturer, and very often he continues to perpetuate the abuse on the woman while giving her the safety or the destigmatization of a marriage. But the woman's position doesn't change inside that marriage, and so we have to really create more options for women, and this is based on the other sustainable development goals like education and nutrition and healthcare and public participation and mobility as well.
Thank you very much. I believe there was another question over here. Yes.
My question is about cultures and societies that are conditioned.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Oh, my name is Daral El-Majid. I'm a grad student. I'm studying clinical psychology at Columbia University. I'm from Kuwait. And my question is about societies and cultures that are conditioned to believe that some forms of harassment is a norm. For example, for catcalling, a lot of people just think that this is just normal men behavior, so they don't necessarily see it as a form of harassment, even if they're uncomfortable with it. So what would the solution be in that situation, like for milder forms of harassment?
That is the debate of the day right now, and one of them is that I think we are changing that because now women are naming the harassment and speaking up. And because of social media and the accessibility of debates from one country to another, everyone is learning what kinds of sexual harassment women are subjected to and what is visited on them. And so they are making it visible in country after country, and I think it's changing the kind of sexual harassment that can happen. So for example, the fact that Ashley Judd has triggered off this debate in Hollywood is now going to create some kind of change in Bollywood in India as well, because people are saying there is a casting couch here and women are being pressured here. The same thing is happening in the tech industry, as you know, in Silicon Valley. Women are saying that there's sexism, there is sexual abuse, they are speaking up. So it's going to go into different places and different sectors of society where women will notice it, name it and shame it. Campus sexual assault, your campaign, It's on Us, has suddenly made visible how dating can itself become a tool for sexual assault and sexual harassment. So cultures are being created as we speak, and it's being created by students like you, who are naming and shaming and making visible when they feel uncomfortable with something. So it is happening.
I believe there was a question over here. There's a mic showing there. Please.
Yeah. Hi, good evening. My name is Shadan Saleh. I'm a news anchor and TV presenter. First, I want to talk about the women in the Middle East. I think it's the worst situation for the women in the Middle East. because now there's a lot of victims of sexual violence. In the past, and I think until now, parents or family for these victims, they kill the woman she abused from somebody. There is a new law coming up. It says when a woman, somebody practice any abuse of her, they let her to marry this guy. And I think what such a life it will be for this woman when they live with somebody who abused her in the beginning. The situation in the Middle East, I think it's really, there's a lot of trouble there. There is a war. Women trying to save themselves, trying to save their children. And when she trying to do that, they abused her. There's a lot of women, I saw these cases, they have a very bad sexual violence because they are in a war countries, like in Syria and Libya and Yemen, Iraq, Palestine, everywhere in other countries. Situation in the Middle East, I think in that way, it's the worst. Because now they let this guy who make this abuse in this woman to marry her, and there is no punishment. They don't put him even in jail. The last things I want to say, there is a lot of human rights and women rights organization in the Middle East, but I think there is nothing of this organization do something seriously for the Arab women. Thank you.
Investigation warrant.
I agree that the violence which happens at home is the violence which then manifests in public, but also the reverse is true, that when there is conflict, then people are so dehumanized that the violence becomes much more vicious, and the bodies of women are very often targeted in situations of war, and so much research shows that.
I believe Ben Adams has a question.
Hi, my name is Ben Adams. I'm with the NYU School of Medicine, but I'm here today in honor of my father, J. Michael Adams. And my question really is for Dr. Gupta, the countries that you named that are changing the role of the laws, shifting the responsibility. Norway, Sweden, Ireland, Iceland. These are all very small countries, and perhaps while I'm not an expert on any of these countries, I would guess that the culture's a bit more politically, the political spectrum maybe is not quite as wide as you might see in countries like India or the United States. Do you think that the laws that work in small countries like that will be able to be applied in a greater context in a larger country with a larger population?
I think so, because they offer us the possibility of what in the United Nations we call a best practice, and we can only try. That's what evolution is about, and if we try, then we see that change does happen. So for example, France, which is still relatively smaller than the United States, so India has just passed a law based on what we now call the Nordic model, and we are hoping more countries will adopt it, and we'll see, because it is a struggle to carry people along in larger countries. There are more diverse opinions and it's not so homogeneous. But I think in the issues of gender, hopefully we will get more consensus. Because it has become an epidemic, and the kinds of violence, the age of the violence, the victims, if you don't deal with it now, then when? We ended slavery, at least not sanctioned by law, and we have ended monarchy in most countries. We've ended apartheid, we brought down the Berlin Wall. So maybe the last frontier is gender equality in the world that we are trying to create.
Thank you. I think there's time for one more question. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you for giving the opportunity. My name is Sita Raman. I admire the initiative taken by Academic Impact to raise this very crucial question affecting women, not just in one place but all over. I was thinking that to stir the consciousness of conscience of many people, the best way is to, in a dramatic form, some sort of programs which the UN Academic Impact is prepared to organize at different places. I represent the Apne Education Group. We will be very happy to contribute our efforts. We have 3 types of promotional wings. One is a ballet dance group, they can join the UN. The second is a yoga group, they can join in propagating. The third is the Bharatanatyam, Indian classical dance. I have with me the representatives of the 3, just for your thing. I just asked them to stand up. Marcia, will you stand up for ballet dance group with the girl, she's here. Madhi for Bharatanatyam and Gail for yoga. So our contribution is there, offer is there to make it a worldwide impact so that crime against women anywhere is crime against humanity everywhere. With that, I want to offer our humble contribution. Thank you.
And perhaps that is a fitting note on which to close. I'm sure we could go on all afternoon. Certainly I have plenty of things. I would like to give the floor finally to Susan Adams. I hope you find that this discussion was in the spirit you hope to encourage.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and Ben and his wife Susie, and the students from SBU. It's so nice to include people from Michael's University and all of these speakers. It's an amazing honor to remember my husband in this way, and the issues that we discussed today would be close to his heart. He was always promoting women, and he defended women and honored them in every way. And he believed that conversations like this and opportunities to talk and learn what's going on somewhere else were big steps, toward maintaining peace and learning more and more about cultures and opportunities. So thank you, Dr. Gupta, and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, especially to the speakers, Mr. Ishimori and Professor Gupta, to the Adams family for honoring us with your presence, and to everybody who came just because it's such a vital and interesting topic. Carry the thoughts with you this afternoon and into your future activities. Thank you.